Jacob wrestled with an angel. And neither one of them won, but Jacob wasn't going to give up. He held on to that angel until he was blessed. Some things we need to just and hold on until we're blessed. Some of you know Leo Tolstoy, the novelist from Russia, great novelist. Certain questions, he said, are put to us not so much that we should answer them, but that we should spend a lifetime wrestling with them. Right. This morning I want to share with you 3 questions that I hope you will wrestle with for the rest of your life. I came across these questions first in a sermon by the former minister of Riverside Church in New York City, William Sloane Coffin, who asked these questions to the graduating class of Colgate University in 1979. The first question is, who will define you? This is something we all have to decide. Who will define you? Now, you've probably heard me say more than once from this pulpit that I'm the product of a Jewish father and an Italian Catholic mother. She's also got a little Lithuanian mixed in there, but a lot of Italian. And this was interesting. As a child, it was like, depending on which group I was with, I had a different identity. With my mostly Irish, Italian, and Polish working class friends, they would call me, this is the Jew boy. And then they'd pile on, and I'd be on the bottom of the pile-on. I was asking in the last service if kids, do they pile on anymore like we used to when we were kids? We just jump on each other until somebody was squished, and the young people said no. They just shoot each other with video games now. And then, when I was with my Jewish friends, and I had a lot of them as well, I was not considered Jewish because my mother's not Jewish. Goyim of the group. So when I was in my 20s, I finally had the opportunity to go to Israel and spend some time there, and I asked the rabbi, I protested to this one rabbi, and I said, how could I not be considered Jewish when my brother and I would have been gassed by Hitler just like everybody else? And the rabbi explained very matter-of-factly that Hitler does not get to define who is a Jew. That, he said, was decided by the Jewish people a long time ago. And it has to do with people whose mothers are Jewish and those who go through a conversion process. So I had to ask myself, who gets to define me? Hitler? The rabbi? My friends? Everyone has to wrestle with this question. If you've applied to colleges, as I know many of you have, if you've applied for a job, someone had to write you a reference. I hope you picked people who like you. Do they define who you are? What they say, their opinions? If you've ever been arrested or suspended from school, does that mistake or that period of your life define who you are? I hope not. I spent much of this past week at the John Hope Franklin Center Symposium on Racial Reconciliation here in Tulsa. I'm really gratified that this is becoming a nationally known, very well esteemed symposium. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of talk this week about how race defines us so much in this culture of ours. It was very interesting that the international guests who were there said, we're saying in their countries, in many of their countries, race is not at all the defining factor for people. It's often region or religion or tribe or dialect or something else like that that defines people. Of course, race is social. It's a social idea, not a biological reality. Not that long ago, the scientists in the National Institute of Health here in the United States put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome. And they have unanimously declared that there's only one race, the human race. DNA research has discovered that it's more common for people of different races to have DNA markers that are similar than people of one's own race. Which means that it's more likely that Reverend Davis and I have DNA markers that are similar than Tamara and I. Or Tamara and Reverend Davis than Tamara and I. So one of the things that defines people in our society is nothing more than a set of categories that were created to classify and divide people in a hierarchy. Now what's ironic about this is that at first, Polish, Irish, Italian, and Jewish people in America were not considered white. But eventually these groups were able to assimilate, sometimes by changing their names, sometimes by changing their customs or ways of talking and ways of being together. Becoming white had major advantages in terms of getting jobs and buying property and being accepted into certain neighborhoods and organizations. In a society where white was considered right, becoming white had distinct advantages. A major downside, of course, for these people whose cultures and heritages were whitewashed in order to get in to the club was that they lost their connection to much of their culture and their own heritage. Some years ago, I was at an event where all the participants were asked to write down a list of the things that you appreciate about being from your race. And so we all had a pen and paper, and we took time and we wrote out our list. And I was profoundly moved when we reported back by the African American, Native American, Latino, and Asian American in this group that their lists were filled with things that they appreciated, including foods and music and clothing styles and ways of being together, dancing. Now the white people's list is a little different. There was no food. There was no cultural factors. Every list said what I appreciate about being white is because, and things like, I never worry about being followed when I go into a store because of my race. I don't worry that the police are going to treat me differently because of my race. I don't worry about not getting in a taxi or not getting an apartment because of my race. I don't have to think about race or prejudice most days unless I decide to take it on as a cause. Right. It became clear to me that the things that people appreciated about being white were all based on advantages and not on richness of cultural heritage. And it really made me start thinking about what does it mean for me to define myself as white. And even though race is nothing more than a socially created concept, it has real implications on people's lives, whether we want to accept it or not. That's why the death of a black teenager in Florida named Trayvon Martin last year created such a strong cultural impact. Because it sure appears that he is dead because he was doing nothing other than walking in the wrong neighborhood while black. And just look at our president. There's no doubt that American society has and always has defined someone who looks like him as black. But we also know that his actual racial and cultural heritage is much more complex, just as it is for many of us. Who will you let define you? Many Native Americans here in Oklahoma have a card that proves that they're a member of a particular tribe. Others don't have a card, but they know who they are. Who defines who you are? African Americans, for much of American history, have been defined by white people. Initially as 3/5 human in our Constitution, as property for a long time, later as separate but not exactly equal. And beauty in American society has often been defined by white European norms of what's beautiful. What's considered classical music and high arts of literature and creative arts have primarily been defined by European styles. Other forms are considered folk or primitive or oriental art. And because of this, people who are not primarily of European background have often defined themselves or been defined by European or European American standards. Who will define you? Gay people have long been defined by straight people and by certain interpretations of religion. Definitions such as abomination, perversion, sinful come to mind. Who will define you? Women have been defined for most of history by men and by certain interpretations of religion. Those of you who identify as women in our graduating class, who and what will define you? As a minister, I have to ask whether you will allow yourself to be defined by people or allow yourself to be defined by God. And what I mean by God is, well, one thing's for sure, what I don't mean by God is a old white man with a beard up in the clouds. How interesting is that many people's image of God is both white and male? That's got to have an effect on the psyche. But the most fundamental idea in religion is that we are all children of God. We are all brothers and sisters. We are all loved and lovable and worthy. So for me, I don't care whether you use the word God, or what name you use for God, or whether you think the idea of God is helpful or silly. That's up to you. We heard a number of different perspectives up here this morning. What matters to me is whether you understand that we are brothers and sisters, right, equal and valuable on the most fundamental level. So when I suggest that you let yourself be defined by God rather than people, that's what I mean. It's not so much a statement about some supernatural deity. It's a statement about the nature of humanity, that we are all brothers and sisters. By the way, the genetic researchers I talked about earlier also discovered and printed that we all evolved in the last 100,000 years from the same small number of tribes that migrated out of Africa and colonized the world. So I really am black.
There you go. There you go.
We all are. All right. So, but whether you get it from religion or science, the point is we are all brothers and sisters. The second question I give you to wrestle with this morning is, who will define the United States of America? There are some who call us the great Satan, and others who call us the number one nation on earth. And I hope you're smart enough not to believe either one of them. Who will define America? There are some in this country who think it's disloyal to ever say anything negative about our nation. They say, we're number one, and if you disagree, then you can go live somewhere else. But remember that essential to democracy is a vigorous exchange of different perspectives. I have a friend, Amir, who once asked, now, if you had bad breath, would you want someone to tell you? I said, yeah, I want to know. I'll get a mint, brush my teeth or something. He says, but who tells you you have bad breath? Only the people closest to you. Your family or your really good friend.
People who can smell it.
People who you're close with. Why? Because they care about you. I hope that you care enough about this country that you will not only celebrate its many, many virtues, but that you also courageously and forcefully lift up your voices in the great democratic experiment that we call America. And not let yourself ever be bullied into thinking that constructive critical engagement is wrong or disloyal. That's what love looks like, not blind, ignorant patriotism. That is no substitute for love. Who will you let define America? Let me be clear. We are indisputably number one in the incarceration of our citizens. We put more of our citizens in prison by many factors than any other country on earth.
Right? Have landed free.
Way more than Russia did at the height of communism, more than any of the repressive dictatorships do throughout the Middle East, all of them together. And we put more of our minority populations in prison, primarily for nonviolent drug crimes, than any country, even including South Africa during apartheid. There are more African American, in particular African Americans, in prison today than there were in slavery in all of its time in this country. And we have more women in prison than anywhere else on earth. There are certain things that we can say, guaranteed, we are number one at. Now, some people would just say, well, this is just the cost of freedom. I don't believe that, and I hope you don't believe that either. It's the cost of our disgracefully inadequate public education system and our refusal to fund it sufficiently. There's an easily traceable school-to-prison pipeline in this country that is not only immoral, it's ridiculously expensive.
Right?
It's not the cost of freedom. It's part of the legacy of a highly racialized society. And it's the cost of privatizing our prisons and making it a profit incentive to keep them full. One could also argue that we are number one as the richest nation in the world. But the problem is that the wealth is almost all concentrated up at the top 1%. While 30% of our nation are living below the poverty line. Economists say that we're coming out of the recession now. But that's not true for the bottom 30% of this country who are still struggling to have enough money to feed their families. I heard one mother say with tears in her eyes that at certain times of the month, all she can do is buy the cheapest loaf of bread that she can find. And at night, when they don't have food for dinner, her kids just take the bread, toast it, and put white sugar on it and eat that because at least it fills their belly and gives them enough calories to get through the night. This incredible income gap is unsustainable, and it's not good for anyone, and it's not good for our nation. As the Dalai Lama said, it causes the top 1% to live in anxiety, and it causes the bottom to live in frustration. We can do better. But right now, we're in a political arguments about whether our government should provide a safety net for its citizens. Let me explain something. When a country's economy is in trouble and millions of its citizens are out of work and have no source of income and are having trouble feeding their families, of course the government has a role and a responsibility. It's not a debate. Who is the government? We are the government. It's of the people, by the people, and for the people. If you want to talk about something that's an abomination, a perversion, and sinful, don't look in the Bible. Look at the politicians and all the rest of us who have food in our bellies and roofs over our heads, who are talking about whether it's important enough or not for a country to provide its people with adequate education and food and medical care. Who is the government? We're the government. Abraham Lincoln didn't say, of the corporations for the corporations. He didn't say, of the wealthy for the wealthy. As a matter of fact, he didn't even say, of the middle class for the middle class. He said, of the people for the people. Of course, we have a moral responsibility. Now, I understand that not everybody here is going to agree with me on all these issues, and I can already imagine the line outside my door about me being too political in the pulpit later on today. But I want to say to these graduates, you all, it's now time for you to vote, either now or very soon. And it's your not only opportunity, it's your responsibility to vote in every election, local and national, for the rest of your life. We need you. Things are getting crazy. in this country right now. And that's the reason for my second question. Who will you let define America? And I want to be clear because this, as that line forms outside my door later, then there's going to be people who are going to say, but it's all about personal responsibility. How come you don't talk about personal responsibility? And other people can say, you think it's all systemic. You're giving people an excuse not to do anything. And I want to say it's not either personal responsibility or systemic. It's both. It's always been both. There's no excuses not to take personal responsibility no matter what's going on in our lives. And anybody who says it's one or the other is naive. Don't believe it. So this leads to the third question. What kind of world do you want to leave to your children? When your children are donning their caps and gowns and sitting in this front pew, what kind of world do you want to leave to them? What kind of legacy do you want to leave in this world? Because we now have the power to split the atom and to destroy the planet. Dr. Coffin once said, if we don't learn to be meek, there will be nobody around to inherit the earth. What kind of leave to your children? Will they be able to go outdoors? Will the people on the earth remain divided by religion and hatred and ignorance while nuclear weapons spread even further throughout more countries and become more and more available? Will all the wealth in this country continue to become concentrated on a smaller and smaller elite while the gap between the rich and the poor grows even more profound? What will you do? What will your legacy be? That's what we're asking our leaders today and our students. These are the questions that I hope you'll wrestle with for the rest of your life. Who will define you? Who will define America? And what kind of legacy will you leave to your children? Because when your education is finished and the paper tests are over, the real test begins. To our graduating seniors in particular, there are a few things I do not want you to question. My love for you, my respect for you, and my expectations for you. For most of you, I will at least go down in your memory as your childhood minister or one of your childhood ministers. And I want you to remember that I love you and I respect you and I have expectations of you. I expect you to always work hard and take pride in whatever you do. I don't care if your path is to be a dancer or a dentist or a musician or a physician, or if it's to work for a .com or be a stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad. That didn't rhyme. But work hard, because it matters, and take pride in whatever you do. Whatever you're doing, take pride. Don't hide, take pride. No. You're going to wrestle with all of these questions that all of us wrestle with about identity and power and systems of oppression and justice, but never, ever, ever, ever let those become excuses for you not doing your best. Have enough pride in yourself, no matter what's going on in the world, that you are going to still do your best. And of course, have fun. Enjoy life to the fullest. I'm going fly fishing next week myself. We always have to decide, as E.B. White said, we have to decide every morning when we wake up whether we're going to spend our time savoring or saving the world, which makes it hard to plan your day a lot of times. But it's really important to do both. You're going to go places that the rest of us can't even imagine in our heads right now. So when you take with you our love, our deep respect and appreciation for you. We love you. Amen.